Her own husband sold her body like a gambling chip. The whiskey-soaked air of Desert Springs, Arizona hung thick as summer heat when Mason Blackwood's weathered boots crossed the saloon's threshold. Three men lay sprawled in the dust outside, breathing, but wishing they weren't. The townsfolk gave Mason a wide berth, eyes fixed on the Colt Navy that had sent those men to the dirt faster than a rattlesnake strike. "You still shoot like it's Cold Harbor, Captain," whispered an old Confederate, nursing his bourbon in the corner. Mason didn't answer. At 50, his iron gray hair and sun-carved face told more stories than his mouth ever would. His eyes, the pale blue of winter ice, scanned the room with the practiced vigilance of a man who'd buried too many friends to carelessness. The year was 1877, 12 years since Appomattox, but the war lived on in the scar tissue of men like Mason. Some wore their wounds on the outside. Others, like him, carried them buried deeper than a mini-ball. Sheriff James Crawford watched from behind the bar. At 35, he wore a star on his chest and carried a debt in his soul. Mason had pulled him from the mud of Cold Harbor, a Union bullet lodged in his side, Confederate troops advancing. Mason had pressed a filthy bandana against the wound, dragged him through gunfire, and whispered instructions on cauterizing the wound with gunpowder and a ramrod, a soldier's medicine that had saved his life. "I owe you everything," James had whispered then, delirious with pain. "Then remember it," Mason had replied, "when the time comes to pay." The saloon's piano fell silent as Robert Lane staggered in, fingers twisted in his wife's blonde hair. Sarah Lane, 26, once beautiful, now hollow-eyed, stumbled as her husband yanked her forward. "You're embarrassing me, woman," Robert hissed, whiskey fumes clouding his words. "Can't even pour drinks without spilling them." Mason watched, jaw muscles bunching beneath his beard. Since losing his own wife and son to an Apache raid 5 years back, the sight of a woman mistreated stirred something primal in his chest. "Lane," Mason's voice cut through the saloon's murmur. "Take your hands off her." Robert's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "Mind your business, Blackwood. She's my property." Mason rose slowly, his 6'2" frame unfolding like a mountain shadow stretching at sunset. "No man owns another in this country. War settled that." The room emptied fast, chairs scraping back as patrons found urgent business elsewhere. Robert released Sarah, his hand dropping to his holster, but even drunk, he wasn't fool enough to draw. "This ain't over," Robert snarled, backing toward the door. Mason watched him go, then turned to Sarah. A purple bruise bloomed beneath her left eye. "You need help, ma'am. My ranch is 10 miles west. Broken Arrow. You'd be welcome there." She didn't answer, eyes downcast, but Mason saw her shoulders straighten just slightly. Sometimes knowing there's somewhere to run was enough to keep a soul alive another day. Later that night, Mason cut through the alley behind the bank, taking the shortcut to his horse. Voices drifted from the open window of Victor Harlow's office, the town's banker and loan shark, a vulture in a tailored suit. "I need more time," Robert Lane's voice, desperate now. "You've had 6 months," Harlow replied, ice in his tone. "I want my 2,000 by Friday." "I don't have it." A pause, then Harlow's voice, lower now. "Your wife, she still has some value." "What?" "One night with her clears 500 of your debt." Mason froze in the shadows, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. "She's my wife, for God's sake," Robert protested, but weakly. "Then be a husband and provide for her. Friday night. Leave your door unlocked. I'll come after midnight." Mason melted back into the darkness, rage burning cold in his belly. He'd seen this before. Men who treated women like cattle to be traded when times got hard. He'd put bullets in such men during the war. The peace had changed the rules, not the principles. 3 nights later, Mason sat his horse beneath an ancient cottonwood, watching Robert Lane's small house on the edge of town. At midnight, Robert staggered out, heading toward the saloon. At 12:30, Victor Harlow's tall figure moved through the darkness toward the house. Mason dismounted, intending to intervene, when a scream shattered the night, raw and primal. Glass broke. A thud, like something heavy hitting a wall. Then silence. Moments later, Sarah Lane burst from the house, her nightdress torn, clutching a wooden board against her bare chest. In her other hand gleamed an iron fireplace poker, dark with something that caught the moonlight like oil. Blood. She ran blindly into the desert, barefoot, not seeing Mason in the shadows. He mounted his horse, following at a distance. Whatever had happened in that house, the law might not see it kindly, and Mason Blackwood had long ago lost faith in the law's ability to deliver justice. The desert night slashed at Sarah like a blade, stones and cactus spines tearing her feet as she fled blindly through the darkness. 10 miles she ran, her body breaking with each step, her mind a storm of terror and disbelief. Mason followed at a distance, giving her space while ensuring she didn't collapse in some arroyo to be found by coyotes. The girl had spirit. He'd grant her that. Whatever happened back in that house had broken something loose inside her, something that wouldn't be chained again. Near dawn, she stumbled onto his property, collapsing beside the dry well at the edge of Broken Arrow Ranch. Mason approached slowly, his horse's hooves announcing him from 50 yards out. No point in startling a woman who'd already been through hell. Sarah scrambled backward at his approach, pressing the wooden board to her chest, her voice breaking into a scream. "Don't! Don't pull it away!" Mason dismounted, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. He'd approached wounded animals with the same caution, creatures in pain that might lash out from fear rather than malice. Without a word, he shrugged off his worn leather coat and held it out to her. "Ain't nobody hurtin' you no more, ma'am," he said, voice low as distant thunder. "Not while you're on my land." Her eyes, wild as a trapped fox, searched his face for deceit. Finding none, she snatched the coat with trembling fingers. The iron poker lay beside her in the dirt, its tip crusted with dried blood. Mason built a fire while she huddled beneath his coat. He didn't ask questions. 15 years of war and frontier had taught him that some stories needed to breathe before they could be told. He handed her jerky, coffee, and silence. When the sun breached the eastern mountains, painting the desert in gold, Sarah finally spoke. "I killed a man tonight." Mason nodded, poking at the fire. "Harlow?" Her head snapped up. "How did you—" "Heard him and your husband talking. Followed you from town." He met her gaze steadily. "You defending yourself?" A single tear cut through the dust on her cheek. "He came into my bedroom. Said Robert had sold me to him. To clear a debt." Her voice broke. "He tore my nightdress, pushed me down. I grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and I... You survived," Mason finished for her. Later, at the ranch house, he tended her lacerated feet with the steady hands of a man who'd patched bullet wounds under cannon fire. His homestead was spare but solid, a 2-room cabin with a stone fireplace, barns, corrals, and 60 head of cattle grazing the scrubland beyond. No luxuries, but everything a body needed to survive. That night, Sarah's screams woke him from a dreamless sleep. He found her thrashing in the spare bed, fighting invisible hands. "I killed him," she sobbed when consciousness returned. "God forgive me. I killed him." Mason sat on the edge of the bed, not touching her, giving her space to breathe. "In the war," he said quietly, "I killed 27 men. Could have been more. After a while, you stop counting." Sarah stared at him through the darkness. "Does it ever stop haunting you?" "No," he answered honestly. "But you learn to live alongside it." He paused. "Sometimes surviving doesn't make you guilty, ma'am. Makes you alive." For the first time since she'd arrived, Sarah's breathing slowed. The terror in her eyes ebbed, replaced by something Mason recognized: the wary calculation of someone reassessing their place in the world. The peace lasted 3 days. Then Robert Lane rode into Broken Arrow, shotgun across his saddle, liquor on his breath, even at morning. "That's my wife," he shouted from the yard. "She's coming home with me." Mason stepped onto the porch, thumbs hooked in his belt, deliberately positioned between Robert and the door. "She's not property, Lane. She's wanted for murder," Robert spat. "Harlow's in Doc's office with his skull cracked open, barely breathing." Mason's expression didn't change, but inside his mind raced. Harlow was alive. The game had changed. "She defended herself against a man who admitted to buying her from you," Mason said evenly. "How do you think that story plays out in court?" Robert's face flushed crimson. His hand twitched toward his shotgun. "You threatening me, Blackwood?" With a speed that belied his age, Mason's Colt appeared in his hand, hammer cocked. "Not a threat, a promise. Ride away while you still can." Robert's bravado crumbled. He wheeled his horse around, kicking it into a gallop, dust billowing behind him. Sarah stood in the doorway, face pale. "He'll be back." "Yes," Mason agreed, holstering his weapon. "With the law, most likely." That evening, Mason took his Winchester rifle down from above the fireplace, methodically cleaning each part. His fingers worked with practiced familiarity, muscle memory from 1,000 such evenings during the war. "I should leave," Sarah said, watching him from across the table. "You've risked enough." Mason continued his work without looking up. "Where would you go?" Her silence was answer enough. "We've got something Harlow and your husband don't," Mason said, reassembling the rifle with smooth precision. "What's that?" "Friends in the right places." He set the Winchester aside. "And the truth." The next morning brought Sheriff James Crawford to Broken Arrow, dust coating his duster, his young deputy trailing nervously behind. Mason met them in the yard, coffee cup in hand, Sarah standing resolute beside him. "Mason," Crawford nodded, dismounting stiffly. The old war wound still troubled him in the mornings. "James," Mason returned. "Coffee?" The sheriff shook his head. "This isn't social. I've got Robert Lane in town demanding I arrest his wife for attempted murder. Harlow's backing his play." Mason's gaze didn't waver. "And?" Crawford sighed heavily. "And I remember Cold Harbor. Remember who pulled me out when the Rebs were about to finish me." He turned to Sarah. "Ma'am, did Victor Harlow come to your house uninvited?" "My husband invited him," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Sold me to him for $500 off a gambling debt." The deputy shifted uncomfortably, but Crawford's weathered face remained impassive. "And the poker?" "Self-defense," she said simply. Crawford studied her, then turned back to Mason. "Harlow's got half the town council in his pocket. This won't end here." "I know it," Mason replied. The sheriff nodded once, decision made. "Keep her here. I'll handle Lane and buy you time." He remounted his horse. "Mason?" "Yes?" "We're square after this. The debt's paid." As Crawford rode away, Sarah turned to Mason, confusion in her eyes. "Why is he helping us?" Mason watched the dust cloud disappear down the trail. "Because 13 years ago, I gave him back his life, and a good man always pays his debts." That afternoon, Mason rode the perimeter of his property, checking sight lines and natural cover. War had taught him to prepare battlefields before the enemy arrived, and enemies would come. Men like Harlow didn't suffer humiliation without reprisal. Sure enough, at dusk, a rider approached from the east, not from town, but from the direction of Harlow's mining interests in the hills. Mason watched through his spyglass as the man made camp 3 miles out, just beyond Mason's property line. The stranger's face was unfamiliar, but the distinctive bullet-shaped scar on his neck and the matched pearl-handled Remingtons marked him instantly. "Butcher!" Thompson, a killer whose reputation had spread from Texas to Montana, a man who'd gunned down 32 men, including 2 U.S. Marshals in El Paso. Harlow had hired the deadliest man in the territory. When Mason returned to the cabin, he found Sarah on the porch, a shotgun across her lap. "Company coming?" she asked, reading his expression. "Worse than I thought," he nodded, dismounting. "Butcher Thompson." Sarah's face paled. Even in Kansas, that name carried weight. "You ever fire one of those?" Mason nodded at the shotgun. She worked the pump action with practiced ease. "My pa raised 3 daughters on a Kansas homestead. Said a woman who can't shoot might as well lie down and die." For the first time since she'd arrived, Mason smiled, a brief crinkle at the corners of his eyes. "Your pa was right." That night, Mason prepared the battlefield. He dug ankle-breaking pits in likely approach routes, concealed under thin layers of brush. He rigged tripwires to shotgun traps, frontier artillery that would fire without a human finger on the trigger. He positioned spare-loaded rifles behind hay bales and water troughs, ensuring he'd never be more than 5 steps from a weapon. War had taught him that victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the best prepared. Near midnight, Mason heard horses approaching. 5 riders, moving slow to muffle sound. He touched Sarah's shoulder lightly, waking her from where she dozed in a chair. "They're here," he whispered. She nodded, lifting the shotgun without hesitation. "Remember," he said quietly, "aim center mass. Don't try for fancy shots." Outside, Mason slipped into the shadows of the barn, rifle ready. He'd survived Shiloh and Antietam and Cold Harbor. He'd be damned if he'd die in his own front yard to hired guns. The first rider came in fast, torch in hand, aiming for the haystack. Mason's shot took him from the saddle before the flame could touch dry straw. The night erupted into gunfire. The battle for Broken Arrow Ranch unfolded like a nightmare in the darkness. Mason's carefully laid traps sprung with deadly precision. A tripwire sent one rider tumbling into the dirt, his scream cut short by the thunderous report of Sarah's shotgun from the cabin window. Another attacker triggered the rigged scattergun hidden in the water trough, the blast catching him full in the chest. Mason moved like a ghost through the shadows, the old soldier's instincts guiding him. He fired twice from behind the barn, then rolled to a new position by the corral. Never stay still, never fire twice from the same spot. Lessons written in blood on a dozen battlefields. 3 attackers down, 2 remaining. One was Butcher Thompson. The gunfighter's voice cut through the night, cold as a grave. "Blackwood, send out the woman, and you might live till morning." Mason's answer came in the form of a rifle shot that splintered the fence post inches from Thompson's head. The gunfighter ducked, returning fire with both revolvers. Bullets thudded into wood and kicked up dirt as Mason pressed himself against the barn wall. Inside the cabin, Sarah crouched beneath the window, reloading the shotgun with trembling hands. A shadow passed across the glass. She looked up to see a man trying to force the back door. Without hesitation, she aimed and fired through the thin wood. The door exploded inward, carrying the would-be intruder with it. Outside, Mason heard the shotgun blast. 1 more down. Now only Butcher Thompson remained. "Your boys are dead, Thompson," Mason called. "Harlow ain't paying enough for a suicide mission." Silence answered him. The gunfighter had gone to ground. Mason edged along the barn wall, every sense straining against the darkness. A boot scuffed against stone to his right. He pivoted, firing in one smooth motion. A grunt of pain told him the shot had found flesh. But then pain exploded in his thigh. Thompson's return fire had scored. Mason fell to one knee, warm blood soaking his trousers. He rolled behind a water barrel as more bullets splintered the wood around him. "Getting old, Captain." Thompson's voice came from the shadows. "Cold Harbor was a long time ago." Mason's breath caught. How did Thompson know about Cold Harbor? The answer came as Thompson emerged from the darkness, limping slightly from Mason's bullet, but still deadly. Blood gleamed black on his shirt beneath the moonlight. Robert Lane paid extra, Thompson explained, revolvers trained on Mason's position. Told me all about you, how you interfered, how you took what was his. A cold smile split his face. Some men don't like losing their property. Mason calculated the distance to his fallen rifle. Too far. The Colt on his hip? Maybe, but Thompson was faster. Men half his age were faster. Lane's a coward who sells women, Mason replied, buying seconds. What does that make you? Thompson shrugged. Rich. Behind the gunfighter, the cabin door creaked open. Sarah stood framed in the doorway, shotgun raised. It makes him dead, she said, and pulled the trigger. The blast caught Thompson square in the back, lifting him off his feet and throwing him forward. He landed face down in the dirt, twitching once before going still. Sarah stepped off the porch, shotgun still raised, moving to Mason's side. Her eyes never left Thompson's body. Is he? Yes, Mason confirmed, pressing a bandana against his bleeding thigh. You're a hell of a shot, ma'am. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they moved toward the cabin. Pa always said, when you aim to kill a snake, you don't miss. At dawn, they'd counted 4 bodies in the yard. The 5th attacker had crawled away, leaving a blood trail that disappeared into the scrub. Mason Field dressed his leg wound, while Sarah buried the dead behind the barn. No ceremony, no markers. Just the desert reclaiming its own. Harlow will send more, Sarah said, pouring coffee into tin cups. And Robert knows where I am now. Mason nodded grimly. We need to end this, at the source. That afternoon, despite his wounded leg, Mason rode into town alone. He found Sheriff Crawford at the jailhouse, cleaning his Remington. Heard gunfire last night, Crawford said without looking up. Out by your place. Butcher Thompson and 4 others, Mason confirmed. Sent by Harlow. The sheriff's hands paused. Thompson? Christ, Mason. He's killed 32 men, now 33. Mason leaned against the doorframe. Sarah put a shotgun load in his back. Crawford whistled softly. That woman's got sand. He set the pistol aside. What do you need? Information. Where's Lane? Staying at Harlow's place. The 2 of them are thick as thieves now. Crawford's eyes narrowed. What are you planning? Mason straightened. Just a conversation. With your Colt doing the talking. Crawford stood. I can't let you murder them, Mason. Not even for Sarah. Not even for Cold Harbor. Not murder, Mason replied. Justice. That evening, Mason waited in the shadow of Harlow's office building. His leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but he pushed the pain aside. Old soldiers knew how to compartmentalize suffering. As dusk deepened into night, Harlow and Lane emerged, heading toward the saloon. Mason followed at a distance, watching. Something wasn't right. Lane walked with the cocky swagger of a man who held all the cards. Harlow, despite his bandaged head, seemed equally confident. Inside the saloon, Mason took a corner table, hat pulled low. He ordered whiskey but didn't drink. Through the smoky air, he watched the 2 men huddled at a table, sharing a bottle and occasional bursts of laughter. A saloon girl passed close to Mason's table. He recognized her, Jessie, who sometimes carried messages for Crawford. Sheriff wants you, she whispered without stopping. Mason waited 10 minutes, then slipped out the back door. Crawford stood in the alley, face grim in the lamplight. You need to see this, he said, leading Mason to the jailhouse. Inside, Crawford unlocked a desk drawer and removed a folded paper. Found this in Robert Lane's room. Harlow paid him to leave it where I'd find it. Mason unfolded the paper. A deed of sale. Robert Lane had sold his marital property rights to Victor Harlow for $500, signed and witnessed. They're building a case, Crawford explained. With this, they can claim Sarah is legally Harlow's property, that she stole herself by running away, that you're harboring stolen goods. No court would uphold this, Mason growled. Maybe not, but it would drag Sarah through hell before dismissing it. Crawford took back the paper. And there's more. Harlow's claiming attempted murder. Says she attacked him unprovoked. Mason's fist clenched. We both know that's a lie. What we know doesn't matter. It's what we can prove. Crawford sighed heavily. Harlow's got Judge Wilson in his pocket. Trial starts Monday. Mason's mind raced. 3 days. Not enough time to gather evidence. Not enough time to build a defense. Not through legal means. I need to warn Sarah, he said, turning to leave. Crawford caught his arm. Wait, there's something else. He hesitated. Lane and Harlow are planning something tonight. Overheard them talking about finishing it once and for all. Think they might try to burn you out. Mason nodded grimly. Thanks, James. Mason, Crawford called as he reached the door. Whatever you're thinking, be careful. I can't protect you if you cross the line. Some lines need crossing, Mason replied, and disappeared into the night. By the time Mason reached Broken Arrow, clouds had swallowed the moon. The air hung heavy with the promise of rain, the first in months. He found Sarah on the porch, rifle across her lap. They're coming, he said without preamble. She nodded, unsurprised. I've been watching the road. Saw dust about an hour ago. 6 riders moving slow. Mason's eyebrows rose. You've got good eyes. And a good spot. She gestured to the roof. Been keeping watch from up there. Mason smiled despite himself. This woman continued to surprise him. Inside, he quickly outlined what he'd learned in town. The fraudulent deed, the false accusations, the impending trial. Sarah's face hardened with each new revelation. So they aim to make me property again, she said when he finished, or hang me for defending myself. Neither will happen, Mason promised, but tonight they're coming to make sure of it. Probably burn the ranch, kill us both, make it look like an accident. Sarah checked her shotgun with steady hands. Then we disappoint them. Mason shook his head. Not we. You're leaving. Now. I won't run. It's not running, Mason interrupted. It's strategy. I need you to ride to the old silver mine in the North Hills. Wait there. While you what? Face them alone with that wounded leg? She gestured to his bandaged thigh. This isn't my first fight, ma'am. He met her gaze steadily. And I work better alone. For a moment she seemed ready to argue. Then understanding dawned in her eyes. You're planning something that needs to look like self-defense. Something the sheriff can explain away. Mason didn't answer. He didn't need to. Sarah nodded slowly. The silver mine. How will I know when it's safe to return? I'll come for you. If I don't come by noon tomorrow. You will, she said firmly, gathering her few possessions. Because I'm holding you to that promise. After Sarah departed through the back country, Mason set to work. He positioned lanterns in specific places, creating the illusion of movement inside the cabin. He soaked hay bales with kerosene and positioned them strategically. He loaded every weapon he owned and placed them within easy reach of his chosen positions. Then he waited, Winchester across his lap, as the storm clouds gathered above Broken Arrow. The riders approached just after midnight, silhouetted against the horizon by a flash of lightning. 6 men, as Sarah had counted. Mason recognized Robert Lane's hunched figure in the lead. Beside him rode Victor Harlow, his bandaged head visible even at a distance. The others were hired guns, men with more greed than sense. They stopped just beyond rifle range, conferring briefly. Then Lane and 2 others split off, circling to approach from the south. Harlow and the remaining men continued straight on. Mason smiled grimly, exactly as he'd expected. They were surrounding the ranch, cutting off escape routes, standard military tactics, predictable to any man who'd fought at Shiloh. The first drops of rain began to fall as Harlow's group approached the barn. Mason watched through a crack in the boards as they dismounted, carrying torches protected from the rain by oilskins. One man approached the barn door cautiously. Mason waited until the man was 5 paces away. Then he fired. The shot took the man in the chest, dropping him instantly. The others scattered, diving for cover as Mason fired twice more, forcing them to retreat behind the water trough. "That's one," Mason called into the night. "5 more to pay for trespassing on my land." From the south came answering gunfire. Robert Lane's group shooting at the cabin where they believed Mason and Sarah were hiding. Bullets splintered wood and shattered glass, but found no flesh. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the ranch in stark relief for an instant. In that flash, Mason saw Harlow gesturing frantically, sending his remaining man toward the house while he took cover behind Mason's own wagon. The rain came harder now, drumming on the barn roof. Mason adjusted his position, moving to cover the approach to the cabin. The hired gun was moving low and fast, pistol extended. Mason let him reach the porch before firing. The man dropped, clutching his leg, crawling for shelter beneath the steps. "2 down," Mason muttered. From the south, Lane and his men had realized the cabin was empty. They were moving cautiously toward the barn now, using the rain and darkness as cover. Mason tracked their approach, waiting for the right moment. When they were 30 yards out, he struck a match and touched it to a fuse, a coil of powder-soaked rope that snaked beneath the barn wall toward the hay bales he'd prepared. The fuse sputtered in the rain but caught, sparking as it burned toward its target. Mason rolled to a new position as Lane's men opened fire on the flame. 5 seconds later, the kerosene-soaked hay erupted, creating a wall of fire despite the rain. One man, caught too close, went up like a torch. His screams cut through the storm as he ran blindly, flames consuming him. 3, Mason counted, no satisfaction in his voice. The remaining hired gun broke cover, running for the horses. Mason let him go. The man had no stake in this fight, and Mason had no quarrel with him. That left Lane and Harlow, the architects of this misery. Through the rain and smoke, Mason caught glimpses of the 2 men conferring. They'd realized they'd been outmaneuvered, that Sarah wasn't in the cabin. Their plan was unraveling. Good. Mason circled behind them, using the confusion of fire and storm as cover. His leg wound slowed him, but years of tracking Apache raiders had taught him to move silently even when injured. He closed to within 10 yards before Lane spotted him. "Blackwood!" Lane raised his pistol, but Mason was faster. The shot caught Lane in the shoulder, spinning him around. His gun discharged harmlessly into the mud as he fell. Now only Harlow remained. The banker backed away, eyes wild with fear. "Wait, we can make a deal." "Like the deal you made with Lane?" Mason advanced steadily, Winchester leveled at Harlow's chest. "Or the one where you tried to claim another man's wife?" "The woman attacked me." Harlow's hand moved toward his coat. "I have rights." "Not anymore." Mason fired. Harlow crumpled, a red stain blooming across his expensive shirt. His hand fell away from his coat, revealing not a gun, but a folded paper, the fraudulent deed of sale. Mason turned to Lane, who lay clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Your turn." "Don't kill me," Lane begged. "Please, I was drunk. I needed the money. Not my judgment to make." Mason dragged him to his feet. "That belongs to the woman you sold." By dawn, the rain had stopped. Sheriff Crawford arrived with his deputy to find the ranch still smoldering in places, but largely intact. 3 bodies lay covered with canvas near the barn. Robert Lane sat tied to a post, his wound bandaged. "Jesus, Mason," Crawford surveyed the scene. "What happened here?" "Harlow and his men tried to burn me out," Mason replied simply. "I defended my property." Crawford's eyes narrowed. "And Lane?" surrendering to face justice for selling his wife and conspiracy to commit murder. The sheriff sighed heavily. And Sarah? Safe. Mason met Crawford's gaze steadily. She'll testify against Lane at his trial. Crawford nodded slowly. Self-defense then. Harlow and his men trespassed, tried to burn you out. You responded with appropriate force. He glanced at Lane. And this one surrendered after participating in the attack. It wasn't quite the truth, but it was a version the law could accept. That's how it happened, Mason agreed. As Crawford and his deputy loaded Lane onto a wagon, Mason saddled his horse. He had a promise to keep. The old silver mine lay nestled in the northern hills, abandoned since '68 when the vein had played out. Mason found Sarah waiting at the entrance, rifle ready until she recognized him. It's done, he said simply. She searched his face. Harlow? Dead. Lane's under arrest, facing trial for selling you and conspiracy. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had changed. A weight lifted, a chain broken. Thank you, she said quietly. Mason nodded once. Words seemed inadequate for what had passed between them, what they had endured together. 6 months later, Desert Springs had changed. With Harlow's corrupting influence gone and Robert Lane serving 20 years in Yuma Territorial Prison, legitimate businesses flourished. The mines paid fair wages. The saloon still ran gambling tables, but without the predatory loans that had enslaved half the town. Sheriff Crawford and Mason patrolled the county line together occasionally, keeping peace in their own quiet way. The debt of Cold Harbor had been paid in full, replaced by something more enduring. Mutual respect between men who understood that sometimes justice required walking outside the strict boundaries of law. And each evening, Mason Blackwood rode into town to escort Sarah Walker. She had reclaimed her maiden name after Lane's conviction, home from the schoolhouse to Broken Arrow Ranch, where a room of her own awaited. They ate supper together, speaking of cattle prices and children's progress, rather than the violence that had brought them together. Some wounds, Mason knew, never fully healed. The nightmares still came for both of them, Sarah thrashing against phantom hands, Mason reliving Apache war cries as his family died. But between the darkness, they had carved out something resembling peace. One evening, as autumn painted the cottonwoods gold, Sarah paused on the porch of the ranch house watching the sunset. "Why did you help me that night?" she asked suddenly. "You could have minded your business. Most men would have." Mason considered the question, his weathered hands resting on the porch rail. "During the war, I saw men do terrible things, saw good men turned into animals by what they witnessed." He paused, searching for words that rarely needed speaking. "After I promised myself I'd never stand by again, not if I could stop it." Sarah nodded slowly. "And if there are others like Harlow out there?" Mason's eyes, blue as winter ice, met hers steadily. "Then they'll find they're not facing a frightened woman alone anymore." She smiled then, a rare sight that transformed her face from merely pretty to beautiful. "No," she agreed softly, "never alone again." As the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Mason felt something long dormant stir in his chest. Not love, not yet, but perhaps its first cousin, the recognition that some souls, having walked through fire together, emerge forged into something stronger than either had been alone. In the quiet of the porch, with the smell of sage on the evening breeze, Mason Blackwood, 50 years old, veteran of America's bloodiest war, survivor of its harshest frontier, found himself contemplating a future that held more than mere survival. A future built not on what had been lost, but on what had been found in the crucible of violence and courage. Something forged from both iron and blood, yet stronger than either alone.